Well, thank you all for being here again for my conversation with Elizabeth Bawol. She is a creative director at Wide Eye Creative of brand and strategy. And did I say all that right so
That was
far?
all right. Yep.
um, I've known Elizabeth for many years and have admired her work and the professional journey she has gone on from places like AmeriCorps, right here
Yeah.
in Baltimore, which I'm
Yep.
curious to hear a little bit more about. I didn't realize you were part of that. We both share a common history of Maryland Institute College of Art.
That's right.
And then you spent some wonderful time, it sounds like, at Planned Parenthood, leading their
Mhm.
creative strategy and direction. And then over to Wide Eye, where you've worked on some really high profile campaigns, most recently the Democratic National Convention, all of
That's
the
right.
brand. And yeah, so it's been quite a ride. And today, I think we are going to dive into a lot of different topics and we'll see where it goes. But as always, just kind of talking about how we, as creative people, as strategists, as people that are just always growing and trying to learn and do better, we know that we always need to break through, or as your website said, collapse the box. Uh,
Hmm.
Great quote. Uh, what is it? Collapse the box. Uh,
Take a knife to it.
yeah,
Good
step
Banksy
outside
quote.
the box, collapse the box, and take a rough and sharp knife to it.
Attributed to Banksy. I presume it was actually Banksy. I didn't hear it firsthand.
That's great. Um, so thanks for being here to talk with me today. And I loved some of the things that you sent over that were kind of on your mind.
Yeah.
And, one of the things, I guess, just over your career as a creative, has there been anything that you've kind of held on to as a tried and trusted, like if I go to this well, I'm going to find the answers that help me get to wherever it is I'm trying to get to, or whatever, through whatever blocker
Yeah.
you're encountering, whether that's in work or in life?
That's a really great question. I feel like, this whole career of mine, it's not necessarily been strategic. It's actually been quite a wandering journey. So going with my gut has been a big part of that. And it sometimes has led me to great places and sometimes not. But for the most part, it's a win to follow your gut. I think that, it's not the sexiest answer, but almost without fail, after a few years in the business and a few years of really professionally like making things, sort of that knowledge that the only way to get there is through. Like you can't get around the hard work. You can't get around going through it all and the hard parts. And there's always going to be hard parts when you're creating something and innovating. But trusting that sort of process, even if the process isn't really rigid, doesn't always follow the same steps. I know from the brand side, it almost never follows the same steps.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you feel from the interactive and digital space too. But so like it's trusting the process and knowing that if you roll up your sleeves and do the work and go through, you'll arrive somewhere because you've put in the work. And I think um, that pans out almost every time.
That's a great answer. I think I've got that book sitting over my bookshelf. The Only Way is Through. And I guess, that's why the good things wouldn't feel so good if it was just easy to get them all the time.
Yeah. I
Um,
find a lot of people are sort of like looking for the formula, especially like young in your career. It's like, well, but it maybe next time if we follow these steps will be easier. And I think the answer is it just isn't easy.
I know. It's amazing to me that we as a species just continue to look for the magic pill.
Yeah, we do.
And we still waste a lot of time and money believing that it exists.
That magic pill is just time and work.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
pain and fear, right? Because
Mhm.
it's also a lot of unknown. The through
Dead ends, right?
part,
Yeah.
there's no guarantee of when and how you're going to get through it.
Right.
So you have to be willing to enter into a very scary place. And I would say from a business perspective, it's
Yep.
even scarier because how do you put scope around that?
Well, it's true, and there's a bravery and a faith, right? And if
Yeah.
you're not necessarily generally a person of faith, like having faith in that is such a deep sort of an experience. I think that working for makers in particular can be really helpful because I do think that people that have been makers and then became directors or became owners and things of companies, like at least they know that there's no clear path, that it's not like a formula you can just apply to everything. I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As I've been, talking to other people who've had long, successful careers, and we get into the topic of like what you should charge for an hour, and I'm like, well, your hour
Mhm.
is a lot more valuable than someone who's just starting out's hour, because
Yeah.
it's even though you still have your throughs that you've got to go through,
Yeah.
right? Like you're a lot more likely to kind of have an amazing idea in 5 minutes.
Right.
Um, Does that mean that you charge for the 5 minutes? That it's
Or
like,
what
no,
it's
you
worth.
have your entire, it's like Picasso saying, scribbled on the
Yep.
napkin and charged $10,000 for it. And the lady said that just took you 30 seconds to make it. And he said, it's
Right.
taken me
In a
65
lifetime.
years to make it. Yeah.
It's so
So,
true.
um, along those lines, what advice do you give to the younger professionals that are coming into this field who are butting up against the deadlines and the deliverables, and yet, that part of that process is the going through and the unknown?
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's no amount of advice that teaches you, or like hearing from me, you got to push through it. You will get there. Like you have to experience, I think, doing that enough times and having success at the end of that road to know that that advice is sound.
Yeah.
So it's really tough to just tell someone kind of starting out that they're going to hit it if they really put in the work and use the talent they have, but also trust the process. I really kind of think that the only thing that teaches young people in this business is really like the wins that they have and the failures that they have along the way. Like that's what gets you to a point of confidence that, the hard work is worth it.
Do you get suspicious of things being easy, or like if things are seem a little too obvious? Like when do your
Yeah.
spidey senses like kick in and to start questioning things?
That's really interesting. You mean like when guiding other people, like with younger people or
Well, yeah,
in general?
especially when guiding other people, because that like the last thing they want to do is hear that they need to
Right.
like change something
Yeah.
or revisit it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that like it's not so much that I get suspicious as like, everybody can get lucky. There are people, you'll get lucky, you'll have a good idea, or something a breakthrough will happen early sometimes. It's just that's going to be the rarity, not that's going to be the exception, not the rule. So I'm a little distrustful of the folks that are kind of like, oh, well, I nailed it in the first half hour every time.
Yeah.
But also, I think that the older you get, the less subjective this work becomes too, because you're looking at, if you really want to do something different, you want to really do some creative that breaks through, there has to be some sort of strategy guiding that. There has to be some deep understanding of who it's for, or who it's about, or both, usually both, and sort of the intersection there. And so you can measure it against, oh, does this just look cool? Or does this actually meet the measure of success that we have strategically? So I think it's easier to call out what does and doesn't work because it's
Yeah.
not really all that subjective.
Well, here's another question for you. How much do you think that foundation of strategy, that, as you know, a good, exciting, innovative strategy that really does connect with, the mission or the vision or the the authentic, like whatever it is, the brand,
Mhm.
um, in a way that like gets, all the rockets firing, all the engines firing, and like it really does provide that velocity that
Yeah.
will make the work better. Is that something that you think can be can be analyzed by by an outsider who's just kind of experiencing it, or do you think that's just something that's like a nuance and felt in the work, even though the people that are working on it have the briefs and have developed the strategy and all those things?
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about strategy and what I think keeps me really engaged in it and trying to get better every time is that I don't know how often it's sort of the core soundbite that comes through in the analysis at the end of a strategic process. Like, I think that that's helpful and often can be a great North Star. But sometimes the things that I've seen designers on my team or brand creatives or even campaigners come to is like some part of the strategy that I didn't maybe even spend as much time on. So, like some little nugget in the research or like some little piece that someone said in a global office that really resonated that unlocks the whole thing for them. So, like, I might look at strategy a little differently in that, like, while the analysis of a strategist is so important, there's just like a lot in that discovery journey, that strategy journey that can unlock. And I don't think you always know which piece it's going to be. I don't know if that
Yeah,
answers your question, but
it does. It reminds me of one of the something David Ogilvy was talking about. Well, when they he came up with the tagline for, I think it was Mercedes or Rolls Royce or something, and it was saying that the clock is like the ticking of the clock is the loudest thing you'll hear in the car, and it's something he picked up in like a very technical manual that the people
yeah,
that were on the production line were reviewing for quality control. And he said, like, learn everything you can about your client's, product, business, whatever it might be, because you never know where that little
yeah,
bit of inspiration and that, like, that little thing said so perfectly what no giant, obvious strategy could.
yeah,
And
exactly,
that
yeah,
was about time, right? Spending the time with the client, having those, and doing the research.
yeah.
But that brings me to another question, which is, now that we've had COVID and everyone's virtual, how important do you think discovery and research is, or like getting a sense for a client, since you work with clients too? How much do you think in-person time together is important?
Yeah, I might be a little bit of an anomaly here, but I do my work and have since before the pandemic. I think like 98% of it is probably remote, including the work with my creative teams and the work with my clients. And I have been able to build connections and build relationships and workshop did interact do interactive workshops with groups of people up to 30 and like no actual real post-it notes and whiteboard. I think there's just tools now, like there's tools, there's human connection. I think you have to be of my generation, which I wouldn't reveal, in that I'll pick up the phone and ask. I will get on a Zoom and chat through something. I'll work it out on an online whiteboard. It's not always in written communication.
Yeah,
But I don't consider it a serious barrier. I really don't. As much as I'd love to get in a room with people and put some sticky notes on the wall and like look at a big visual landscape, there's just so many tools. So it doesn't really. I'd be interested to hear how the teams I've worked with over the years have done. But like when I was at Planned Parenthood and I was building a team, I was in Maryland. Part of the team was in DC. Part of the team was in New York. We then ended up going virtual entirely. And we were working with 20 people at any given time and some agencies, and they were all over. And I don't think it was a barrier. If anything, the quiet time I had in my office or studio when I wasn't in an office space was the most valuable to my coming up with ideas and being able to get to a place. So for me, the balance of introvert and extrovert that I am, I haven't found it a barrier.
that's great. Along the same lines, how important do you think it is to spend time or have interests that are like completely, have nothing to do with your work, or and not just hobbies, but like how often or how important do you think it is to indulge what might be seen as like fringe interests or rabbit holes to go down.
I mean, I think that's potentially the whole game. That's like the real that's where a lot of the real kind of juice comes from. I think the one thing I would say, now that I live where I live, which is kind of rural and away from a metropolitan area for the first time, is like I miss the sound of a city. Like I miss being able to walk around a city and observe the kind of like noise and buzz that happens there and culture that happens there. Like that's my one sort of like real missing piece here in the quiet. But like I think those rabbit holes, those distractions are actually where a lot of the connections happen that lead to great ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like,
And I don't even
again,
think
you have to have
those
the
connections
faith,
are
right?
necessarily happening. It's just in creative brains, these little pieces find a home years later. I mean,
Yes.
I lived in Baltimore for so many years, and I still write things down I heard a kid say, or like, like little bits of things that I experienced there. It just like became a part of me, and I still think about it quite a bit.
Yeah, I guess all those experiences and rabbit holes do kind of they're ingredients
Yeah.
that you're just adding to your soup, your
Yeah.
people soup. Your yeah. Um, so I think this is a good time to kind of move over and talk about AI, as we're talking about how important it is to do the research and get the strategy right, and the only way is through, and all these things that are really about and having other interests where you take deep dives and all this stuff kind of sticks and becomes part of who you are. Now you've got generative AI
Hmm.
and all of these tools that can produce stuff that passes a lot of sniff tests,
Hmm.
at such an amazing speed that, like, the amount of shallow the amount of shallow stuff is hard to fathom.
Hmm.
I gotta sneeze. Oh, see, I mentioned it on camera and it just totally
It stops.
disappeared.
I'll come back
Wow.
later.
Um, and so I feel like there's this pressure point, right, where everyone's like,
Hmm.
oh, well, I don't need to pay for this time or these thinkers or these creatives or these writers because the AI can just do it. Um, and the AI can do a whole bunch of stuff, but
Sure.
what's good? And then how do you push AI to like really develop deep, well thought out, um, well executed ideas when
Hmm.
it's really oriented towards like kind of spewing a rainbow of crap,
Yeah. I
out
mean,
of
this is like, there's so many questions in this question. Um, AI so far, even generative AI, it's all derivative. And to me, all of these tools are great tools in our toolbox, right? But it's so far not technology that is bringing the kind of idea generation, the kind of genius that can come from authentic lived experience. Um, and it's not coming up with ideas that are new, right? Like it's always going to be derived on what existed. And so there's a limit to which that could ever be as smart or as innovative or as interesting as what is something new in the mix, right? And to me, it's like having a great researcher on your team, but not necessarily a great ideator, like having someone that can pull stuff so quickly and frame it up, right? But
right.
it's all from what has been done before. And I don't know about you, but in most of the rooms I'm in where we're trying to come up with something that really resonates, it's about the current moment and what's next. And it misses that's what next piece to me.
Yeah.
Now, I also think that there's a very small part of the population that knows the difference between really great creative and what AI could spew out. And I think that's maybe where there's a slippery slope and sort of danger is that, it's sort of like the slow boil. are we going to lower our standards or lower the kind of innovation that happens sort of slowly because of the way AI generates ideas, right? Like, are we going to lose touch with the really genius types of creative, the really good stuff, because there's so much crap or so much that's derivative? And I think that's sort of where you're seeing that already with misinformation. And I just think that like that's where sort of the risk is. That and just the copying of really original artists over time. But
Yeah, and I think this great sort of copying or sameness has been, seeping into everything um,
yeah.
already. So, but I do think there's a lot of people that really want to embrace that. And I think it's probably because it lowers the barrier to entry and nobody wants to have to work that hard to get to great creative, right? Because it is
Yeah.
scary, it is hard. So it's a lot easier. It's sort of like when the digital cameras came around
Hmm.
in the 80s, in the like late 80s, early 90s, and all the photographers were like, the
Yeah.
blasphemy. And all of a sudden everybody's like, I'm a professional photographer.
Yeah.
Um, in the end, you still really want a real artist, a real trained photographer to work with, not just every, but there was many years, and I think the same thing happened with web
Yeah.
design, all the design and desktop publishing programs that became available. All of a sudden, everyone's like, "Oh, my cousin in the basement's doing my brand." It's
Yeah.
like,
Canva. Yeah. It's there.
so now that's going to happen on a lot of fronts.
Yeah.
Um, which is scary if it's like, oh, we're doing medical research with, yeah, Joe's doing it on ChatGPT. We don't
Yeah.
need to pay the.
I think what's really interesting about that though is like I do agree that it's like democratizing the world of creation, right? In a way that, there's some good to that. There are
Right.
folks that you might not have heard from, right? Or seen anything from that might be able to get into the game and into the mix, right? And come up with some really ingenious things using AI as a tool. And like there's still going to be, like I think that authentic things and authentic art and ideas will become a currency and a differentiator in a bit more dramatic way. Like you're saying about photography, real photographers, real deep craftspeople are still needed, right? And I think those ideas and those creations become more rare and therefore stand out more because there's so much more noise, right? If everyone's got a microphone, everyone's got a camera, everyone's got ChatGPT, everyone's going to start to sound the same more and more. Like it's just sort of this dull roar, in my opinion. And like
Yeah,
it makes people that really have that spark, that ability to make new things stand out a little bit more. And there's hope in that, I think.
I love that. You've given me some more hope. I can get a little cynical about it all. Along those lines, how do you engage with AI and the tools in your day to day?
Yeah. I mean, I think so far I find it just like an incredible tool for research if I double check it, like I just find like, I remember I heard this thing and I want to use it for inspiration and I can find it so easily or like find 100 versions of it so easily and learn more. So like just from like a groundbreaking sort of like baseline of research, I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting for tone of voice and writing work.
Hmm.
And like ideating. I almost use it as like someone to brainstorm with, if that makes sense. But like very rarely does it spark the idea,
Yeah.
if ever. But it's kind of like throwing a lot at the wall and having somebody in there that can just kind of put the 100 sticky notes up.
That's
I
really
find it a
that's
lot less useful on the visual front. I just find it so generic and I find it lacks any humanity. And I just think that maybe the technology is still catching up and hopefully there are some boundaries being put in place around copyrighted and artist work because that worries me a lot. But I don't find it as helpful on the visual front yet. I'm curious about you though.
um, you said something about it's it's a great sort of brainstorm or research partner, which I totally agree with, but that it's rarely like giving you the the nugget of the idea that you're
Yeah.
gonna be pulling on, right? It's like
Yeah.
it gives you lots of different threads to pull
Yeah.
on once you've given it the idea,
Hmm.
or talked about it, or been like, how does this sound? What is this? Yeah, give me different perspectives. What am I missing? Like, who would
Yeah.
argue this? What would a counter, an argument to this
Yeah.
be? Um, what I so yeah, I mean, I use it in very similar ways. I'll ask it to give me like 20 variations on a headline for a blog post,
Yep.
just to be like, what might sound different. If I ask it, if I just say though, like, here's the blog article, give me a great title.
Right.
Um, it's just
You
usually
can't.
pretty
Yeah.
shitty.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really true. Yeah.
Somebody said it's like all flowers and no heart, and it is
Yeah.
very flowery.
Yeah. That's
Um,
interesting. I mean,
even
if you think about it too, though, just when you think about the amount of information out there that's been amassed, it's pretty whitewashed stuff, right? Like,
yeah,
there's so much less diversity in our just internet archives, and like this, the folks, with the power and with the privilege to archive things online, like it skews white, it skews generic, it skews probably Eurocentric. Like, I don't have like the data behind that so much, but I've seen what comes out when you ask it to create an image, and I've seen how lacking in nuance it can be. It just feels like you're asking a robot to do a thing, like, and
yeah.
it's very, very generic. And that's just, I think, in part, not all the voices are equally elevated.
Yes, and that leads me to a question. Have you tried creating a custom GPT at all? Because the idea behind that is, you can train it on your own or someone else's, voice and information and books and all of that, and then
Yeah.
you're sort of supposed to be kind of working in this purity bubble of, you know, just
Yeah.
whoever it is that you've trained it on. Have you explored much of that?
I have, and I do think again, it's like further along in voice than it is in visual.
Yeah.
But I still find it very flat and almost cliche in a weird way. Like, I often find that sometimes the sound bites just don't add up to the
Yeah,
same
they're
narrative.
cringeworthy often.
Yeah, like, you have to really, really check. Like, and what's funny is I think a lot of people are using it as a tool and that silver bullet, and they're not, like the cover letters, and
Oh
like, I think
yeah.
there's a lot of folks using it that are not checking it, but the signs are all there.
Yeah, pro tip, do not use it for your cover letter.
Yeah, please don't. Please, we all
And
avoid them.
and the other thing too, don't let it just rewrite. It's very pushy. It will
Yeah,
just take liberty and rewrite your stuff.
yeah,
If you
yeah.
don't say specifically, don't rewrite it, tell me where and why you might make a change, whether
Mhm,
that's grammar or flow or tone.
totally.
But I want to see your process and I want to know what you're recommending, because 90% of it I'm going to ignore because it'll strip
Mhm.
the personality and realness out of it.
It really is about how skilled and I think smart the people are that are using it, and so that's where it gets a little worrisome potentially.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tail element of this that builds on, all the other long tails that have been created. Where you're just going to have, they were shallow little pockets, right? Of even if it was complete, conspiracy theory or fake news or whatever, they were still limited in how much the volume could be in each one of
Sure,
those
how
little
mainstream, yeah,
tiny
totally.
fringe pockets. And I think the ability for AI to create and generate so much stuff, again, like I said, that passes the sniff test to your average um, viewer or reader, uh, that's going to make for a very interesting future, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we have to really watch, I think, to maintain a discerning eye and ear, right? Like, that's gonna take effort, that's gonna take work, 'cause it's gonna get better, the noise is gonna get more consistent.
So this goes back to an interesting question that I used to ask, years ago. I was like, why is it that someone who, is not an artist, but just, likes Monets, right? And has a Monet calendar in their kitchen
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
just really likes the pretty pictures. That person will, 9 times out of 10, if there's going to be a big Monet exhibit coming into the museum near that person, that might be the thing that, like, they might go to a museum to see those paintings in real life.
Mhm.
Why does someone who is not like an avid art fan, but is the buyer of the calendars, what compels them to become that crossover? I want to engage with something in real life. And if we take that question and then move it to where we are today, how much do you think people are gonna care
Yeah.
if the Super Bowl ad they're watching was created by humans or created by AI?
I mean, this is like the optimist pessimist on my shoulder here, and I have to like decide which way humanity is going to go. So it's a very big question. I mean, ultimately, when it comes to a Super Bowl ad, who cares? When it comes to a politician speaking in a crowd, it matters a lot, right? So, like, that's where, like, I tend to agree with you that just like folks aren't checking the sources of what they're resharing on whatever their favorite social media platform is, a lot of people just don't care where it came from. They care what friend of theirs or perceived friend of theirs shared it, right?
Right.
So this sort of democratizing has made it, information is so peer to peer that, like, whether or not it's true or false or AI or real production, and I do think AI will probably reduce the need for real production and that industry will be really deeply affected. But
Yeah.
like, I think that it's just going to be a lot harder to tell what the truth is. And my negative side, my pessimistic side is saying, how much do people care whether this is true or not? How much are people just choosing what they want to believe? And
Yeah.
that's where I want to go open up a lemonade stump stand somewhere and leave society and live in the mountain. Like, I don't really know what you do with that, but that is a big fear I have.
I think that's a very universal fear. Um,
Yeah.
a very, very real fear. And I don't think anyone really knows how it's going to go, right?
Nope.
But
For sure.
yeah, I mean, I hate to think that the most prophetic piece of media, in the last 2,000 years is going to end up being the movie Idiocracy, but it might be.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
just where we're going. Um, Everything's getting very easy for a lot of people, and so why have to think outside the box or work that hard?
On the other hand, maybe the voices that are shouting, "Oh my God, no, you have to look at this," will be louder, right? Like, maybe there's a possibility that the more the masses sort of follow this same formula. What is that movie? This, not this, Don't Look Up. Sort
Oh
of a
yeah,
similar kind of an
yeah,
idea.
great movie.
Like, there are people that are so like amazed and irate and loud about how, like, no, this is crazy, pay attention. I mean, the movie doesn't end well, but there's a part of me that thinks that, like, the smart voices, the discerning voices, the people that are seeing what's happening will find new and innovative ways to be heard, and the noise will be so consistent that possibly it'll be easier to hear them. I don't know. It'll be
Yeah,
a very it's a very interesting time to be alive and creating.
it is. It is. I mean, I part of me thinks that everyone's just going to kind of pull back from all of this connection and noise and um,
Sort of
doubt.
swing the other way.
Yeah, I mean, and just sort of be like, yeah, let's meet in the pocket park and have lunch together and read the newspaper and find out what's going on, in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And um, because the physical, you know, you kind of look around sometimes, and COVID was an interesting experience to go through with this, but you kind of look around, you're like, well, this is actually my world. So I can sit and spend all day reading about and freaking out about all this stuff, half of which may be real or not. But when I turn the computer off or I put my phone away, what's actually here
Yeah, right in front of me. Mhm.
and what matters, right? And how much of that am I missing, you know, or not tending to because
I think
of
a lot of
this?
us during the pandemic really, like, had that same similar revelation.
Mhm. Yeah.
That sort of forced isolation, forced slowing down, for lack of a better word, was pretty eye-opening, at least for me, and I know for some
Yeah.
others.
I was okay with it. I
Yeah,
mean, obviously I didn't like all the people, you know, getting sick and dying. And it's terrifying what this, you know, just means in terms of the future
right.
and the next pandemic and all of that. But I didn't mind the slowing down and the kind of focusing on family and
What's right
neighbors
in
and
front
who
of
was
you.
around
Yeah,
your physical world.
yeah,
Um, so you know, with AI and everybody being remote and virtual now, it's a really different kind of career path for somebody who's just getting started.
yeah,
And you know, and I'm seeing a lot of people that had good, you know, confidence in their careers and were more established suddenly be getting laid off, or, you know, companies are shifting or downsizing in a lot of these areas, in the creative services, in digital, in
yeah.
brand, in marketing. So I think it's become a very volatile market. And what, you know, what do you think people need to be focused on if they want to get into it? Like what matters now that's different than what used to matter 20, 25 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think like most things, that silver bullet is not there, and I really wonder how my career would have gone had I had, those kinds of barriers when I was a young creative, because it's so much about being strong in your creative, in your craft, and in your pursuit of good creative is the confidence that the confidence you earn over multiple kinds of different, um what do you call it, like sort of paths, right? Like I had a lot of intersecting paths that got me to where my career is, and I have confidence now based on those successes and or the things I learned along the way. And if you're constantly sort of stopping and starting the way the economy has forced people to be, I mean, I think probably the most important thing is to not forget that building relationships is sort of the key to figuring out like who and where you want to work and where you're going to do your best and thrive. But also, I think it's really important to remember, and I think I kind of just found this out again about myself, to keep making in some shape or form,
Hmm.
if that is the career you want. You know, like the career that I have and the job that I do is not all the facets of me as a creative person, but it fulfills a lot of that. And I have a drive for it. And I think creatives are driven, right? Like they're driven by this desire to make things. And I think make things that matter. And so in the face of sort of the stopping and starting and the number of people who don't know who they're firing, right? Like it's happening in these large groups of
Yeah.
people. And like some of the most talented folks I know have been laid off from various places or have had stops and starts in their career based on what's happening in the world. I think it's just so important to keep making things whatever those things are, and like not being precious about it, but keeping that sort of drive going.
Yeah. I think, you know, I have this painting behind me. I've returned, you know, I've taken longer gaps from painting over the course of my
Hmm.
career at different times. But when I've been at my most disrupted professionally, and it's really because it's the path that got me, you know, on my career path. It all started with making paintings,
Hmm.
with creating things. You know, that was the foundation that started it all. And every time I return to it, you know, I learn new things that I can apply to everything.
Yeah.
Um, you don't need a client or a job or a task, you know, or an opportunity to explore those ideas in whatever it is that you do in your on your own time.
Yeah.
Um, how much do you think those kinds of things are of interest to see? Like when a young designer or creative is applying for a job, and they might have like, here's, my portfolio of professional things or school assignments or whatever. And then they might have their fine art section or their like hobbies section or their writing or whatever it might be. How important do you think that is? Do you pay attention to it? Does it factor into how you think of them as a young
Yeah,
creative?
so I mean, I do. I pay attention to it, and I think what I appreciate about it is I don't think it's a requirement. Some people aren't going to be fine artists or illustrators and designers or, strategists and creators but to me, the versatility of idea generation is really important.
Hmm.
Being able to seek different kinds of inspiration, being able to use different medium to communicate ideas is a really really valuable skill. And I think sometimes, I don't know if you feel this way about art school, but art school set me back a little bit in that I got so incredibly precious about things I made and how I had to make them and the bar they needed to meet, that it kind of got in the way of my creativity. And I think when I see somebody that's got their line art illustrations and their sculptures and their design work on their and they're in their book, I'm like, that's interesting. Like they can explore ideas and communicating with others, working by themselves, working with others, working in this medium, working with that medium. And generally I find that those are more the people that are more able to ideate, the people that I want at the idea table.
Yeah.
Um,
And it shows that
Not just
drive too.
production, but like ideas. And that applies to branding, it applies to campaign, applies to everything.
Yeah.
Websites, user journeys, like you name it. I think that having that kind of thinking unlocks a lot more.
Well, it takes some bravery, right, and some
It takes
lack
a
of
lot. Yeah,
ego. You can't be too precious, like you said. I struggle with the same things, and um, there's nothing that will crush your ego faster than like staring at a blank canvas day after day.
it's really true. Well, and I think that, I've gotten some good advice recently from a former professor of mine I reconnected with, who I just think is a really brilliant teacher and maker. And he was like, give yourself a couple of, this sounds so obvious, but give yourself a couple small assignments, sort of themes, whatever. But like, don't sit there and think, I got to get to the studio, or like, I'm going to do this many hours in the studio this year. He's like, you're going to sit there. It's the blank canvas. He's like, you're just going to spin when you get in there, and that time is wasted. So, like, you don't have to show it to anyone. You don't have to put it on a wall. You can if you want to, but like, don't go in there with, I have to sell this or I have to put it on a wall. Like, go in there with a couple themes and see which one hits and strikes you and that you can, lose yourself in.
Yeah,
And I was like, that's such a simple suggestion. And it's gotten me back in the studio so many times
yeah.
already. So the other thing I think is really interesting is like, even if you don't put your fine artwork, for example, or your photography on your portfolio, because like maybe that is your private work, like
Mhm.
that's okay too. But I think what's really interesting is taking the time to work on your own and being able to work in a group. Like I work in an agency, so much is collaborative, but I am so much better at it if I take the time for my part by myself. Like idea generation as an isolated artist or creator is so important and sort of sometimes forgotten, I think, once you get out into the world.
Yeah. Well, it's a different process, right? How you evaluate your own ideas. Like
Mhm.
I've kept a sketchbook since I was 14 years old, and I use my phone now for the same things. Like anything that I find interesting or pops into my head, I just try to record it, write it down, take a picture of it, because I never know where it's going to start to inform things. And
Yeah.
the same thing too, I'll just literally pick up a brush and just put paint on a canvas with no other. It's just the physical. It's like getting my steps in.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I might see something in that, a few days later, and that will take me off on a journey. So
Yeah.
I love
The 2-year
inviting,
journey.
yeah, I
Yeah,
love
that's great.
inviting that in. But at a certain point in the professional world of, creative services and brand and strategy, like the goal is to connect and to cause a reaction from
Mhm.
that engagement. So it is a lot more than like your own, sharing your own internal creativity. Um, it's a lot more of like connecting with
Yeah.
audiences and making that meaningful in whatever way it needs to be meaningful. And that's not a solo process.
That is not a solo pursuit. And what's interesting is like, I feel like in my professional world, I'm constantly pointing that out. So, for example, I do all this work with nonprofits. I have for many, many years. And the number of times that I have to very gently sort of say, yeah, but you want this brand or this thing, whatever this thing is, to resonate with a person like this or this group of people, right? That is not you. That is not you, executive director. That is not you, board of trustees, lead person. Like, you all have very good instincts about this work, or you wouldn't be here, right? Like, you're obviously leaders, but this brand, this design is not meant to speak to you. And
Yeah.
it's okay if it doesn't, as long as it lands with the people that you want, this next generation of donors you want, this next generation of activists. They may not have the same taste as you. They may not have the same things that drive them. And we have to understand that. Like, that's what you're paying us for.
How many times do you have that conversation and then realize you're talking to like, a narcissist or someone with a personality disorder who
Well,
clearly
I don't know if I should
is
reveal
capable of.
that. I mean, I will say I have that conversation probably at least twice to three times a month with different clients. We have a lot of clients at the same time, but like, I have that conversation a lot because it doesn't occur to everybody. Like, you
Mhm.
get in it when you're in a creative process, and we're really collaborative in the way we engage our clients, and like, they're in it, but we have to constantly sort of remind that it's not about what they are drawn to. It's about the audience, the audience, the audience. And, I would say, maybe 8 or 9 times out of 10, I think that works. Like, you're talking to smart people
Yeah.
who generally know that I know what I'm talking about. And if I can get them to look at it that way, they understand and can, like, sort of approve us in the right direction. Like, that is their job in that space, is to approve us in the right direction and know we know what we're doing and talking about, and that we're strategic about it. There's always going to be every 9 or 10, there's always going to be one that says, no, I'm going to make my board happy.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And I think it's better actually when clients are just transparent about that,
Yeah.
because it saves us all a lot of time. It's a huge disappointment, and it's a shame, because I've luckily been able to work with a lot of clients with some really powerful brands. And to see that sort of power wasted when there's good to be done in the world is hard,
Yeah. Yeah. It's for
for the
such petty,
silliest of reasons.
silly,
Yeah.
yeah, very silly reason.
Yeah. Like, do you want this to be an effective organization, or do you
Right.
want,
You just want
your
everyone
board
to
of trustees to be happy? Like,
you want everyone
and
to, yeah, admire the window shades or
yeah.
the new carpet.
I mean, at our best, we'll make everybody, well, everyone will come on board, but, that's not usually the case.
Well, especially when you've got to prioritize certain audiences, right? I mean, you've worked
Yeah.
in with complex organizations. I know.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember seeing just shock on the faces early on with my higher ed clients when I said, like, here's the long list of audiences that you need to speak to. We're going to put them in ranked order
Mm-hmm.
because we are going to prioritize
Makes people very
one.
uncomfortable.
One is going to be at the top, and we are going to all agree that one is more important than all the others.
Oh, yeah, it's not a popular conversation to have.
No.
I mean, it's also like, what's interesting to me is that a lot of times in the higher ed space, in the nonprofit space, which has some similarities,
Yeah, very.
it's like a lot of times what motivates these multiple audiences is very similar. So, like, you can center what motivates people and still make sure that the journey is designed for the first audience on the list that they give you,
Yeah.
because they're the ones using the website, or they're the ones, like, really interacting with the brand. Like, you can make that hierarchical list. It doesn't mean that others are less important.
Yeah, I also think that I think the desire to like cater to all the audiences especially higher eds and nonprofits, it comes from a place of empathy, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you just have to remind them that, like,
Inclusion. Yeah.
hey, that is really great that you care and you want to be inclusive, but this audience is not expecting to hear from you here. They're not
Right.
expecting it. It would actually be kind of rude for you to try to talk to them here.
Yeah.
They're going to go here,
Yeah.
and that's fine. That's what they're used to doing. They're not going to be offended by doing that,
No.
and they'll miss it if you try to talk to them while you're talking to everybody else right here. So it's okay.
Yeah.
Who's the audience that really expects to be spoken to or engaged with here? Like, let's just talk about that a little
Well, and
bit.
how can you make sure, like, to lean into that empathy, right? Sometimes it's about doing no harm to these other audiences, right? Like,
Yeah.
if this is a website for a program for educators and parents, I don't want kids in the program to look at that site and be like, how am I being talked about here? Like, dude, these adults don't get me. Or like,
Yeah.
like, what is this thing about? Like, I don't want to be associated with it. Like, I want to come from a place of audience empathy. I think you can do that and still gear a product like a website
Hmm.
or, to the audience that's using that tool. And
Yeah.
it's actually quite simple. And you can back that with a bunch of data that,
Mhm.
they might have one student for every 100 parents that come to that site or 100 educators. Like, the data is the piece that it's hard to ignore. Hopefully we try.
You would think, but
We
yeah,
try.
you would think. Um, so I one last question I'd love to kind of dig into on that you sent over, which is a great one, which is, what is like the curse of death? What does inevitably, as you've worded it, what inevitably takes great creative and makes it just average? It's a great question.
I should have prepared my answer. I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean, I got to think about it.
I think, and I'm very curious in your career if this is very similar, but you know, it is inevitably the watering down of an idea, and that is like the most simple way to put it.
Yeah,
But usually, the strongest brands, right, double down on who they are fully, authentically, deeply. They don't care about the haters. They don't care about
yeah,
um, every board member's personal color associate. They double down on
yeah,
what is authentic about their brand and organization. What is the thing that they are there for, they exist for, and who's that person they exist for, right?
yeah,
And it was almost impossible to get a large consensus group of empathetic, smart people through a process where they will all come to the same conclusion about what that looks like. So it's that watering down of the idea that happens chip after chip after chip, like, we're going to please this person here and this person here and change this word and change. It's just that, like,
hmm
chipping away of good ideas. And,
So
essentially not knowing where someone needs to be an approver versus a contributor. And it can
yeah,
really all fall apart.
how do you combat that? I mean, a few phrases, sort of industry catchphrases, come to mind, right? Like design by committee,
Yes.
the never-ending revision rounds,
Oh,
um,
final
final,
underscore
final, final,
revise.
final, right?
Yeah.
Like out of scope, change orders. But I mean, it's a slippery slope, right? How do you even show a client, if you're showing three options and one of them is already kind of the watered down one, you know?
Totally depends on who the people are in the room, because I've done it both ways and sometimes had success. Um, like, some people really need one that they can be like, I hate this. And then they'll pick from the good ones. And then there's other clients who are like, this is about getting to know your clients and discovery, but like the other clients that are like, oh, maybe that horrible one is worth considering. And you're like, oh God, this was a bad gamble. Um, the only way I've ever circumvented this, the only way I've ever prevented it, is to sell people upfront on the kind of process I want to run. And
Mhm.
that is an audience empathy process. That is a deeply collaborative process, but it is not an everyone in the room is a decider kind of a process. It is these are the goalposts. This is where regimen and process really can save, I think, creative. Is
Yeah.
just these people. This is the approver, the single approver, if possible.
Yeah.
And these are the folks that are going to help shape it along the way. And this is where we're going to let you. And then this is the part where we are professionals in an industry of creative, where we have studied and worked to be good at a craft. And this is where you have to trust us. And if you can get a partner on board with that process up front, it's the only time I think I've ever really been fully successful, because almost inevitably there's some curveball along the way, or someone that gets engaged at the end that hasn't been a part of the whole thing or hasn't agreed to those sort of norms up front. And, some things are more watered down than others, but that's where the fail happens almost every time.
Yeah. The trust is such a key ingredient. If
It
you can
is.
have you know, an experienced client who has the trust in what you're doing, well, first of all, you can move so much more quickly.
Yeah.
Um, we've been able to engage with clients lately that, because there's trust, it's like we're 5xing on the timelines, because we don't have to go through all the little like delicate baby steps of like,
Yeah.
okay, now we're going to do this and now we're going to show you that. We're like, can we take a look at your brand, maybe consider some differences? They say yes, we can show them an entirely new, different brand, and they will consider it.
Yeah.
Because it is rooted in really knowing them, really knowing where they're trying to go, and being kind of a partner in that as much as you know a client or a vendor. The dog knows that children are home, so he wants to go say hi, which is probably a good time to wrap it up. This has been an awesome conversation. I could go on and on
I know. I
with you
love talking with you. We should do it
forever.
again sometime.
Let's do it again. Thanks for bringing a not 100% feeling voice
Yeah.
to
Sorry. The cough
no.
drop.
No, I think we're going to have like, this will be the
Second
sexy voice
season.
podcast. Yeah.
Little
I'll
post.
I'll put that in the
Mhm.
trailer.
Yeah.
This one is with the sexy voices.
Mhm.
No, thank you. I'm just such a fan of your work and your thinking and you. So I really appreciate
Likewise.
this, and I hope our conversation will be inspiring, helpful, provide a little camaraderie to anybody who listens. So,
Yeah. Hope so.
all right. Until
All
then,
right.
hang in there, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.